This is a humiliating capitulation on behalf of the EU.
European leaders have lined up to denounce the EU's trade deal with the US, with the French Prime Minister François Bayrou describing it as a submission.
Unbelievable. Absolutely humiliating. The European Union has just signed a deal with the United States that many experts are calling one of the biggest political sellouts in modern trade history. Just days ago, the EU Commission was posturing, drawing red lines, declaring August 1st as a hard deadline, promising retaliation, and warning the US to step back. But now it's clear. That was all a performance. Empty threats, hollow statements. Because when the real talks happened behind closed doors, they gave in, fully and without resistance. Watching the EU leadership try to explain it afterward was almost painful. They offered excuses, called it a complex situation, and asked for understanding, as if the EU, with all its economic weight, had no cards to play against Washington. And what did they walk away with? Nothing. Not a single meaningful concession. The 50% US tariff on European steel is still in place, never even brought to the table. Instead, we got headlines about a 15% tariff as if that was some kind of breakthrough. But anyone paying attention can see it's smoke and mirrors. The steel industry is still being hammered. Even worse, many now fear Trump will raise tariffs again later. And frankly, why wouldn't he? The EU just showed they're willing to fold under pressure. They didn't just give up leverage, they handed over their dignity and critical industries, all for a PR moment that makes Trump look like a winner. That 15%? It may only be the beginning.
President Trump is not reliable because it's 15% now. Before, he had talked about 30%. He had talked about 20%.
Experts are stunned, citizens are furious, and the EU Commission, nowhere to be found, because they know exactly what they did. This wasn't a hard-fought negotiation. This was surrender, polished up with PR spin, hoping no one looks too closely. This deal isn't just weak, it's embarrassing. And yet, it's being paraded around like progress. Before we break down what really happened, make sure to smash the like button, share this video, and subscribe, because the truth is getting buried and someone needs to dig it out.
European Union is going to agree to purchase from the United States $750 billion worth of energy.
Let's get into it. Just weeks ago, EU leaders were striking a tough tone. They warned Trump to back down or face retaliation. That's the message they gave the public, loud and clear. But behind the scenes, the story was very different. Over the weekend, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen quietly met with Trump at his golf resort in Scotland. The meeting lasted just over an hour, and by the time it ended, Europe had already surrendered. Instead of demanding tariff relief, the EU agreed to lock in Trump's 15% tariff on most European goods. Sure, it's less than the earlier threats of 30% or even 50%, but let's be honest. This new compromise is still 3 times higher than the pre-conflict rate of 4 to 5%. What was once seen as a temporary trade war is now the new normal. And the worst part? Some sectors never saw relief at all. European steel and aluminum are still getting slammed with 50% US tariffs. These weren't even discussed in the final deal. EU leaders didn't fight for them, didn't ask for changes, didn't even mention them. It's as if entire industries were brushed aside. So, what did Europe gain in return? Nothing that actually benefits its exporters. No tariff cuts, no legal guarantees, no industry protections. Instead, the EU agreed to funnel $750 billion into US energy. And if that wasn't enough, they also promised an additional $600 billion in broader US investments over the next few years. In total, nearly $1.4 trillion is being handed to Washington, while the tariffs stay firmly in place. This isn't a balanced agreement. This is capitulation dressed up as diplomacy. Now EU leaders are scrambling to reframe the deal as a win. Von der Leyen called it a move toward stability. The German chancellor claimed it was the best outcome possible. But across Europe, few are buying it. Let's remember the scale here. Together, the EU and US account for about 60% of the global economy. European exports to the US are massive. ranging from cars and pharmaceuticals to machinery and electronics. Entire industries depend on American buyers. And now those exports are burdened with higher costs and lower margins. Steel and aluminum producers are taking the hardest hit. Those brutal 50% tariffs remain untouched, and these sectors were already struggling to stay afloat. Now they're expected to survive with even more weight on their shoulders. And yet, the deal makes no mention of them, as if they don't exist. Despite all this, EU officials are publicly praising the agreement. They call it a step forward, but to most observers, this is clearly a concession to pressure, not progress. Trump, meanwhile, is calling it the biggest deal ever made. And he has reason to brag. He got the EU to accept steeper tariffs, commit to massive spending, and walk away with nothing concrete in return. All from a single one-hour meeting. This was not a firm response from a global power. It was a retreat, one that's now being sold to the public as peace. And this is how influence erodes, bit by bit, deal by deal. What's most alarming is that the threat isn't over. Trump still holds all the leverage. The current agreement doesn't prevent him from hiking tariffs again whenever he wants. Europe walked into this deal with demands and walked out with liabilities.
What the EU went into these negotiations hoping for was 0 for 0, 0% tariffs for 0% tariffs. What they ended up with was 0% tariffs for 15% tariffs.
The political fallout was immediate. Shockwaves are rippling through Europe. French Prime Minister François Bayrou didn't hold back. In a blistering address to the National Assembly, he called the agreement a clear act of submission. This is not diplomacy, it's surrender. We have traded our economic dignity to dodge an even bigger disaster. But it's still a disaster, he declared. His anger echoed beyond Parliament. In Paris, spontaneous protests broke out outside the US Embassy. Farmers, labor unions, and industry representatives took to the streets, denouncing what they called a capitulation to Trump's bullying tactics.
This is really a wasted opportunity, I think, for the EU, and absolutely a victory on behalf of the Trump administration.
In Germany, the backlash was just as intense. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who had initially welcomed the deal for sidestepping harsher tariffs, was forced to reverse his stance after a storm of criticism from domestic industries. "I am not satisfied with the result," he admitted. "The German economy will suffer considerable damage, and it won't stop there. All of Europe will feel the heat." Germany's massive auto sector, already under pressure from electric vehicle competition, now faces added costs that could tip struggling firms into collapse. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez echoed the discontent. While he voiced formal support for the European Commission's effort, he made it clear this wasn't a victory. "This was done without enthusiasm," he said. "Europe must wake up. We need to develop our own autonomy in trade, energy, and defense. We cannot continue to bend under pressure from Washington." That sense of betrayal is spreading fast across the continent. In Scotland, thousands marched, demanding the deal be scrapped. In Italy, protesters carried signs reading, "Europe is not for sale," and "Trump's tariffs are economic terrorism." The populist five-star movement wasted no time, calling for an emergency parliamentary session to consider retaliatory measures against American goods. Even EU officials have quietly admitted they got nothing in return.
What are the U.S. concessions? What is the U.S. giving up in the deal, if anything?
So the starting point was an imbalance, a surplus on our side and a deficit on the U.S. side. And we wanted to rebalance the trade relation. And we wanted to do it in a way that trade goes on between the two of us.
So how did it come to this? According to the Wall Street Journal, chaos behind the scenes played a big role. One senior EU official was reportedly searching for briefing documents in a parking lot, using public Wi-Fi on a train to Scotland while key decisions were being finalized. The talks were rushed. Trump's threat of escalating tariffs loomed large. Pressured and unprepared, the EU Commission signed what they later described as a pragmatic compromise. But critics say it was little more than surrender. Meanwhile, Washington is celebrating. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told CNBC, "This is a recognition of the legitimacy of our trade concerns. The EU understands now that America will not sit back and allow its deficits to grow unchecked. In short, Trump forced their hand and got what he wanted. The response from economists has been just as damning. Bank of America warned the deal could damage Europe's long-term competitiveness, calling the shift toward U.S. energy economically suicidal. Reuters mocked the idea that Brussels could control private energy contracts, calling it delusional, especially given that American prices remain higher than those from the Middle East or Russia. Wolf Research noted that while the agreement may reduce uncertainty in the short term, Europe came away with nothing. Even the Financial Times, typically reserved in tone, wrote that the EU had opened the floodgates to more coercive diplomacy from Washington. And the fallout is already visible. The euro dropped 1.3% after the announcement. European stock markets, which initially jumped at the news of avoiding 30% tariffs, reversed course by the end of the day. Investor optimism evaporated. Businesses are now scrambling to understand what this means for pricing, exports, and long-term strategy. But the anger sweeping Europe isn't just economic. It's existential. Pride, sovereignty, and fairness are now front and center. Many Europeans feel their leaders gave in to a president who's mocked their institutions, dismissed NATO, and repeatedly undermined global cooperation. Signing a lopsided deal with him has sparked a deeper identity crisis across the bloc. So where does Europe go from here? A growing chorus is calling for a strategic shift. Some leaders are pushing for trade diversification, deeper economic ties with Asia and Latin America, and more investment in European energy and military independence. French President Emmanuel Macron, though absent from the final talks, is reportedly rallying like-minded governments to launch an EU-first initiative, one aimed at regaining control over Europe's future. Across the Channel, however, a very different story is unfolding. The United Kingdom, acting independently, managed to secure a better deal than the entire European Union. That's not just a political twist, it's one of the greatest ironies in modern trade diplomacy. The EU, once proud of its unity and collective economic weight, was reduced to accepting a 15% tariff agreement, along with billions in forced purchases of American energy and weapons. Meanwhile, the UK walked away with better terms, fewer obligations, and something Europe surrendered at the negotiating table: its dignity.
Really makes you wonder, what is it actually doing for its member states if the UK can on its own get a better deal than this giant economy?
Let's not pretend this is just about numbers. It's about leverage and who actually has it. The EU went into the talks cornered and fractured. The UK, freed from Brussels' slow-moving bureaucracy, approached Washington on its own terms. And it paid off. The British deal excludes any blanket tariffs, avoids massive energy commitments, and actively protects key sectors like finance, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace. While EU officials were begging for time extensions and piecing together last-minute documents on train rides, UK negotiators worked with clarity and precision. And here's the part Brussels can't ignore. One nation outperformed 27. For many, this moment makes Brexit not only look justified, but wise. Had the UK remained under EU command, it would have been pulled into the same one-sided agreement now sparking protests across the continent. Instead, it stood apart, cut a cleaner deal, and preserved its strategic voice. Britain's move reveals something important. Influence doesn't always come from the size of your alliance. Sometimes, it comes from the ability to act decisively. The UK proved that independent diplomacy can still triumph in a world dominated by superpower negotiations. Now, across Europe, the question is echoing louder. What was the point of unity if it leads to submission? The EU was once envisioned as a counterweight to US power. Today, it's looking more like a junior partner, taking orders, sacrificing industries, and dressing defeat up as diplomacy. If the UK's success is any indication, walking away from that performance may have been the smartest move in decades. As the dust settles, the world is watching how others respond. Canada is next in line, and how it navigates this challenge could set the tone for future transatlantic trade. To follow that story, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's coming next.